and welcome to the introduction to Masechet Kiddushin. Masechet Kiddushin discusses the way in which a husband and a wife become husband and wife. So right at the end of Seder Nashim, after discussing all the different complications and doubts that can arise from a marriage, now we're talking about the actual process of creating the marriage. And while the Tanakh uses the language of Erusin, the rabbis use the language of Kiddushin. And they use the language of Kiddushin to distinguish between two stages. We have the stage of the Kiddushin, which is actually the betrothal of the couple. And later, we have the stage of the marriage. Now, in the rabbi's time, these two stages were distinguished by time. They were two separate ceremonies, but each of them had important legal force. So the betrothal was not like today's engagement party, which doesn't have halachic ramifications if a couple breaks off the marriage afterwards, but rather, the betrothal was actually the more important stage when the couple became indebted to one another. So from the stage of the Kiddushin, both the husband and the wife have duties to one another. So in particular, the wife's duties are sexual duties. So if she has sexual intercourse with another man after the stage of the Kiddushin, it will be considered adultery, just like after the full marriage. So those are her duties towards her husband. And the husband also has duties towards his wife, mostly financial duties. So for instance, if he passes away between the Kiddushin and the Nisuin, then the wife will be will be the inheritor. On the other hand, they still don't have all the rights that they will have after the marriage. So only after the marriage, for instance, will the husband have the economic rights to things that the wife produces or creates. Between the Kiddushin and the Nisuin, when the wife is still in her father's home, then her father is the one who has these economic rights to various things that she produces. In the rabbi's time, usually there was a year between the Kiddushin and the Nisuin. And it seems that in the context of the ancient world, this was actually an innovation because we don't hear about these two stages of the Kiddushin and the Nisuin in Second Temple sources or in Qumran scrolls. So it seems that the rabbis innovated this stage based on the biblical text. Today, we combine these two ceremonies. So when we go to a Jewish wedding, we'll actually see both the ceremony of the Kiddushin and the Nisuin separated by the reading of the Ketubah. So the first two brachot that are recited are part of the Kiddushin. Then the husband says, Harei at mekudeshet li b'tabat zu kedat Moshe ve'Yisrael. That's the end of the Kiddushin ceremony. Then we have the reading of the Ketubah, which is intended basically to separate these two ceremonies. And the second ceremony is the Sheva Brachot, which is the ceremony of the Nisuin. The rabbis dealt in this tractate with how do you actually create the Kiddushin. And there are four basic elements that are required for the Kiddushin. The first is that the Kiddushin needs to take place in an appropriate form of acquisition, of kinyan. And the rabbis derived from the pasuk in Sefer Dvarim, Ki kach ish isha u'be'ala, if a man takes a woman into his household and becomes her husband, they learned from the word ki yikach, that kicha is kinyan, it's acquisition. And because regular acquisition is performed through money, so also a wife can be acquired through money. from the word ube'ala, has sexual intercourse with her, they learned that you can also do the Kiddushin, the acquisition, through be'ilah, through sexual intercourse without making a payment. And from the following verse, when a woman leaves a husband's household, when she is divorced and she becomes the wife of another man, they learned that just like divorce is performed through a writ, through a shtar, so too a woman can also be mekudeshet through a shtar, in which the husband writes harat mekudeshet li. So we arrive at the three different kinds of kinyan, acquisition, that the Mishnah describes: kesef, shtar, ubi'ah. So that is the first element, that the Kiddushin have to be performed in one of these three ways. The second element is the desire of both the wife, both the man and the woman, to perform the Kiddushin. So this issue of the ratzon of the sides is very, very important. And so the Talmud discusses various cases in which we might have a question about their desire, about their ratzon. So, for example, both the man and the woman have to be bnei dat. They have to be in full cognitive capacity, and therefore a shoteh, someone who is mentally impaired, cannot perform the kiddushin for a husband, and can also a shotah cannot become a wife. And similarly, there's discussion about what about a young girl. We know that in the ancient world, young girls were also betrothed to boys or to older men. And so because a ktana is not considered to be barat da'at, she's not considered to have full cognitive capacity, she can only be betrothed if her father is also involved. Okay, so it has to be through the da'at of her father. And because this issue of the ratzon of both sides is so significant, then both sides can also create all kinds of stipulations. For example, the wife can say, okay, I'm ready to be mekudeshet, but only if you give me a much larger sum than the minimal sum that is required for kiddushin. Or I'm ready to be mekudeshet, but only on condition that it will be in another 6 months or another 2 years, etc. And similarly, the husband can also make tnaim, and he can say, okay, I want to do the kiddushin, but only if we live in a certain place, for example. This is also related to an extended discussion that we'll see in the Masechet about the role of an agent, of a shaliach, that both sides, both parties can make a shaliach act on their behalf. So we said that we have to have kiddushin in a correct form of kinyan, kesef, shtar, ubi'ah. We need to have the desire of both sides. A third important element is the testimony of two kosher witnesses. The testimony of the witnesses is an essential part of the kosher status of the kiddushin. Okay, so what we need for kiddushin is we need two sides. We need a man and a woman who are able and willing to marry one another, and we need the testimony of the two kosher edim. What we don't need, by the way, is a mesader kiddushin. Okay, that's a role that actually does not have halachic, essential halachic significance to the kiddushin. And I just said a moment ago that we need a man and a woman who are able to marry one another. So that's the fourth element that's important for kiddushin. We need to have a man and woman who are suited to one another. So the kiddushin will only take effect if both parties are Jews. Okay, for example, if one of the one of the couple is non-Jew, then there's no Kiddushin. If one of the couple is a slave, then there's no Kiddushin. The Kiddushin just do not take effect. The Kiddushin also will not take effect if there are other reasons that the two parties are forbidden to one another, particularly if they're forbidden to one another in an issur of karet. So if they are in some way family members and there's an issur arayot between them, or if the woman is actually an eshet ish, she's married to someone else, in those cases, then the Kiddushin just will not take effect. Nothing actually happens in this case. What's interesting, though, is that although there's such a strong emphasis on the willingness and the desire of both parties, and so Kiddushin is actually a voluntary act that is created through the volition of the man and the woman, once they are performed and once the Kiddushin have created a new reality, that new reality has significance and legal significance that is no longer dependent on the agreement of the sides. So there's a new legal relationship that has been created and can no longer be annulled through the volition of the sides, but can only be annulled through one of the ways that the Torah has declared, either through divorce or through death. And Rav Steinsaltz points out in his introduction to the Masechet that there's an interesting correlation here between Kiddushin and Hekdesh. What is Hekdesh? Hekdesh is when I say I want to dedicate a certain object to the Mikdash. So that's also an act that is created through free volition. But once I've dedicated this object, then now the Hekdesh has a different status. Now I can't just use that Hekdesh for as a regular object, because it will be considered me'ilah. It will be considered damaging something that is sanctified. So both in Kiddushin and in Hekdesh, we're creating a new reality of our own volition, but then that new reality has various laws and rules that regulate these relationships or objects. So we mentioned that a woman is acquired. There's an idea of the kinyan. And the question is, what exactly is this kinyan? So the Mishnah says that you can acquire a woman through even the smallest coin, a pruta. And some have tried to argue that indeed the worth of a woman in ancient times was only a pruta. This does not seem to make sense, because we know from Masechet Baba Kama that even the lowliest slave was worth 1 gold dinar, which is a lot more than a pruta. And therefore, we need to understand the kinyan in a different way. It seems likely that the kinyan, what's actually happening in the kinyan, is what is called a kinyan sudar. Just like in any contract in Jewish law, where one object is passed from one hand to another, the contract is not completed through a signature or through a handshake, but rather it's completed through kinyan sudar, which is when the seller gives when the buyer gives the seller some kind of object of a very minimal worth, and that object signifies the larger acquisition that is being passed from hand to hand. So, for example, if I'm buying a house, then I give some kind of small object, a coin or a pen or a napkin, and through that, I'm sealing the deal. And similarly, that seems to be what is actually happening in the Kiddushin as well. And there are many more similarities between Kiddushin and kinyan sudar. In both cases, it's not enough to just pass the object. It has to be accompanied by a statement In both cases, you cannot use a sanctified object, like something from Hekdesh, or something that is asur behana'ah. There's other laws that are parallel between them. Even though the Mishnah says you can do kinyan pruta, the Talmud says later, no, it's actually better to use an object and not to use money. Just like in a kinyan suda, we don't use money, we use an object. And similarly, the woman is the one who has to receive the object, not the father. So even though we sometimes think of the kinyan of a woman as the husband acquiring the woman from her husband, if that was the case, then the object would have to pass from the husband to the father. And the fact that the object, the ring or another object, as we'll see, passes from the husband to the wife, indicates that this is actually a kind of kinyan sudar, a kind of agreement between the man and the woman, in which the man is purchasing something from the woman. Now, what exactly is he purchasing? So it seems he's not purchasing the woman as a whole. He's purchasing the right to something that the woman has, specifically to her sexual loyalty. Okay, now the husband owns the woman's sexuality, and if the woman has sex with any other man, then that will be considered adultery. And obviously, just one more thing to add, obviously also the statement that the man says is directed to the woman. He says, Harei at mekudeshet li. He doesn't direct that statement to the father. Now, what's interesting is that we see in the Masechet a kind of duality in the relationship, because chapter 1 discusses the kinyan and says, ha'isha niknet, so a woman is acquired or purchased. On the other hand, in chapter 2, it's already called Kiddushin. Ha'ish mekadesh is how chapter 2 opens. So there's these two different elements of the relationship. One is a relationship of kinyan, and one is a relationship of kedusha or sanctification between the couple. So chapter 1 discusses acquisitions, and it doesn't discuss primarily even the acquisition of a woman. It discusses all kinds of acquisitions, the acquisition of a regular woman, the acquisition of a yevama, the acquisition of slaves, the acquisitions of animals, the acquisition of various kinds of objects. And sometimes this part of chapter 1 has even been called Masechet Kinyanim, so the tractate of acquisitions, because it deals with all kinds of transitions and transfers from one reshut to another reshut. The second part of the chapter discusses obligation in mitzvot and the differences, particularly between men and women, with regard to this issue that women are not obligated in all of the mitzvot. Scholars have discussed very much at length the relationship between these two groups of mishnayot. Some have suggested that Masechet Kinyanim is earlier. Some have suggested that the part about mitzvot is earlier. I would like to suggest just a beautiful drasha of one of the Parshanim, the Pnei Yehoshua, who says that there's a relationship between the idea of kinyan and mitzvot. And he says, after Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi had arranged all the different kinds of kinyan, all the different kinds of acquisition in the first half of the Perek, he moved on to a more abstract spiritual form of acquisition. And that's related to mitzvot. So all the acquisitions, women, slaves, animals, objects, those are all acquisitions in this world. But how do you acquire your place in the next world? That you do through mitzvot. So that is his drasha for connecting the two parts of this chapter. Chapter 2, as I said, the language changes to the language of Kiddushin. And this chapter discusses at length the different stipulations that make the Kiddushin valid, and also the different stipulations of shlichut, of agency. So even though the Talmud says, mitzvah bo yoter mi bishlucho, it's actually better for the Kiddushin to be performed directly between the man and the woman, nonetheless, there are all kinds of situations and circumstances in which agency is required, and this chapter discusses those situations at length. Both the man and the woman can appoint a shaliach, and the shaliach has also, there's all kinds of requirements. He has to be a Jew, he has to be an adult, he has to be ba'al da'at, so he has to have full cognitive capacity, just like the husband needs in order to perform the Kiddushin. There's also a discussion here of what is the object through which you perform the Kiddushin. We mentioned that you can use puta or shve puta. And then there's a huge range of anything that's worth a puta, anything that's worth a penny. So there's a long discussion about different objects, different foodstuffs that can be used for Kiddushin, different laws that relate to this issue. For example, you cannot use an object that has been used for avodah zarah for Kiddushin, but you can use something that has Kedusha. For example, tithes, trumot u'masrot, can be used for Kiddushin. In the Talmud, we hear occasionally that Kiddushin were performed with a cup, perhaps a cup with something in it. Sometimes we even hear about different kinds of food stuff that were used for the Kiddushin. We know that this tradition continued past the time of the Talmud, because we find in the Sidur of Rav Saadia Gaon that the regular formula for Kiddushin was become betrothed to me with this cup and what is in this cup. And only in the 12th century we hear in Sefer HaItur, written by Rabbi Yitzchak of Marseille, of Provence, that there are places in which they give a ring into the cup, and then the husband says, with this cup. So we hear a transition from cup to ring, and then later already just the ring. Chapter 2 also discusses what happens when things start to go wrong. So what happens if there was a mistake or an intentional error that one of the spouses made? What happens to the Kiddushin and various different kinds of doubt that emerge in these kinds of discussions continue also in chapter 3. Chapter 3 discusses many different kinds of stipulations, tnaim. Some of them are very much parallel to tnaim that we have learned about already in Masechet Gitin. So for example, just like in Masechet Gitin, we heard your divorce if you give me 200 zuz. So here we'll find your mekudeshet when I will give you 200 zuz. So we have a lot of mirror images between Gitin and Kiddushin with regard to the tnaim. The second part of this chapter discusses all kinds of doubtful cases. For example, a husband betrothed his daughter, but he forgot which daughter he betrothed, or he forgot who he betrothed her to, or different kinds of doubts that can emerge from debates between the two different sides. So if one side said, if the husband said there were Kiddushin and the wife said, no, there were no Kiddushin, or the opposite, what do we do in that kind of case? And how does this affect questions of ne'emanut and trustworthiness? The third subject this chapter deals with is what if there is some kind of problem in the relationship between the couple? What happens to the Kiddushin? Are there different relationships, like we mentioned, like if they're somehow related, in which the Kiddushin just won't be valid at all? And there are other cases in which the Kiddushin will be valid, but they're forbidden. And therefore, the husband has to give the wife a get, even though they just got married. And then another question that emerges from this is what happens in a case where the couple are not allowed to be married? For example, a Kohen and a Grusha, they nonetheless got married and they had children. What is the status of these children? And this discussion continues in chapter 4, which deals with all kinds of blemishes, pagam b'yuchsin. So what is the status of children who were created out of a forbidden union like this? There are 10 different categories, like mamzer, natin, halal, etc. And the question is, which of these children their status continues for future generations? After how many generations will they become regular Israelites again? What happens if two different progeny from different kinds of pagamim, different kinds of blemishes, marry one another? So, for example, what happens if a natin marries a halal? How will this affect their children? All of these complicated questions. And the tractate ends with a subject that maybe should have opened Seder Nashim, which is the Isurei Yichud, the prohibition on being together in a closed space, man and woman. And perhaps this is kind of, a way of signing off Seder Nashim and saying, if people would just make sure to protect the holiness of the sacredness of the Jewish family, then none of the different problems that emerged in Masechet Sotah, some in Masechet Yevamot, some in Masechet Gittin, none of these would occur at all. And of course, there's much more to say about gender segregation and gender relations in general in the rabbi's world, and much of that is reflected throughout Masechet Kiddushin. Good luck and enjoy.